Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our tutorial series on World in Flames Collector's Edition. I've got a short video for you today on a very specific subject, and that subject is notional units. It's a rule that can be a little confusing to players new to the system, and while I've talked about them and mentioned them in context of some other rules such as paradrops and invasions, I haven't actually presented all of the rules pertaining to notional units in a unified chunk. So I'll do that here today, and also take advantage of this to talk about a couple of corrections to the invasions portion of the last video. So we'll get to the corrections first, and then we'll dive into the notional units thereafter. The first correction involves shore bombardment, and in the invasions video, I had mentioned that the limit on the amount of shore bombardment factors that can be used in a land combat in a coastal hex is restricted to no more than the modified combat values of the land units involved. That is correct. However, Collector's Edition has added one additional limitation, and that is that you may only use as many ships to provide shore bombardment as you have land units involved in the combat. So, as an example here, if we have two U.S. infantry corps invading from the 3-box, accompanied by these surface ships here, we would have the 5-4 halved to 2.5, and the 4-3 would be halved to a strength of 2, for a total of 4.5 invading combat factors. The Americans would not only be restricted to 4.5 factors, but they would also be restricted to only using 2 ships. So the New York and the Texas would have 3 shore bombardment factors each, in this case, for a total of 6. However, that would be reduced to 4.5. If the battleships were unavailable, and the only ships the U.S. had that could provide shore bombardment were the cruisers here, they would be able to use the Wichita and the Indianapolis, or the San Francisco, but they would not be able to use all 3 since there are only 2 invading units, and therefore it would be 4.5 land factors plus 3 shore bombardment factors, for a total of 7.5 before any air support. Now for the other correction / clarification, which is a little bit more involved. Now, the other correction involves which hexes are eligible for invasions. I had stated that the hex needed to have an all-sea hex side and be adjacent to a hex dot. That's not necessarily the case. It has to be adjacent to a sea area. And where I got the hex dot being adjacent to a hex dot was an interpretation of the rules as defining what exactly constitutes the sea area. Now, the rule in question is 2.1.1 hexes and hex dots. It's found at the very beginning of the rulebook on page 6. And it's unfortunately a little unclear. It could be clearer. WIF does have a rather long history of some unfortunate lack of clarity, although I will say that the Collector's Edition rulebook is by far the best as far as consistency and clarity goes in the rules. So this is more of a legacy from earlier editions. The relevant sections would be the first couple of paragraphs here under 2.1.1, where it talks about the land portions of the maps being divided into hexes, as we see here. And then a coastal hex is a hex which contains both land and sea. I guess the first question is, if it contains land and sea, is that then considered part of a sea area? Unfortunately, rule section 2.1.2, titled Sea Areas, really only talks about which sea areas are adjacent to one another, rather than coming right out and explicitly saying that sea areas are defined as the hex dot portions of the maps. So continuing with this, it was simply my interpretation of where the sea area begins, because if you will recall, for naval air missions, a naval air unit or an air unit flying a naval air mission must fly till it reaches its first sea dot or hex dot before it can enter the sea box's one of the sections of the C box, which again sort of reinforced the interpretation that the hex dots mark off where the C areas are. However, an equally valid argument would be these ports like Makassar here in the NEI. If this port is not adjacent to the Timor Sea, then how do the ships move from the port into the sea zone? And the fact that the rules do state, and I'll read verbatim here, a coastal hex is a hex which contains both land and sea. So it's perfectly reasonable interpretation to then say that a coastal hex and the sea area or the sea that is in that hex is in fact part of the sea area, which would mean that I was in error when I said that you require an all-sea hex side that is adjacent to a hex dot. That would not necessarily be the case. You would simply need just the hex to have at least one all-sea hex side that is adjacent to the sea area in which the invading units are located. So that would change the example I gave you down here in Northern Australia. Prior, under the interpretation I'd given before, these 4 hexes would be the only hexes eligible for invasion here in the north. However, now needing only an all-sea hex side, you could see hex 2714 is eligible for invasion, as is 2614 and 2514 as well. However, 2513 is still not eligible for invasion because neither of the 2 hex sides that have C on them are all C hex sides. You can see there's land on this hex side, and there's a little bit of land right here east of where the river empties into the ocean in this other hex. So the desert hex here would be off limits under that interpretation, but not any of the other hexes. Also, where it will have the most effect will be here in the NEI. It means that Makassar is a port that is invadable from either the Timor Sea or the South China Sea, because the sea area border runs right into the port symbol. It also means that Balikpapan here is also eligible to be invaded because of the all-sea hex side here. So I wanted to just kind of point that out, go over that. I apologize for any confusion. And again, it's not the clearest thing in the rule book. Having looked back at the previous edition rule books that I have that cover the same topic, the language is very, very similar. So I don't think they really addressed it in when they were putting together the collector's edition rulebook. Certainly not like they did with some of the other more vague or confusing portions of it. So again, I apologize for any confusion on that. And invasion hexes merely require an all-sea hex side. Now let's take a look and see what the rules say about notional units. Now, notional units only come into play when a hex is attacked by a paradrop or an invasion, and they are not represented by any playing pieces in the game, hence the name notional units, because they represent military forces that are too small to be represented with a discrete counter at WiFCE scale. So think stuff like coastal defense batteries or security battalions, lines of communications, troops, that kind of stuff. The notional unit is the same nationality as any country with a real unit in the hex. And if there are no real units in the hex, then the nationality is the same as the major power that controls that hex that's being invaded or paradropped on. Now, the basic combat factor of all notional units is 1. However, that can be modified by a couple of circumstances. First of all, if the notional unit is defending a city hex, such as, say, here at Mogadishu, you would add +1 to the strength. Also, if it is defending a home country hex of the major power that controls the hex, you would also add a +1. So in this case, we would not add an additional +1 for Italian Somaliland because, assuming it's controlled by Italy, the home country for Italy would be Italy. So we have just a +1 if we are invading Mogadishu due to the city, but not for the home country hex. Further, if the hex being invaded is not stacked with, but it is in the zone of control of a friendly unit, you would also add a +1. So if the territorial unit were actually in Mogadishu, the notional strength would be the basic factor of 1, +1 for the city, bringing it to 2, and then that would be it. If, however, the territorial were on the coast here, it would be 1 for the basic factor, +1 for the city, and then a third factor for being in the zone of control of a real friendly unit. And then finally, the notional unit's combat strength, you would also add the shore bombardment modifier of the sea box section that each invading unit is invading from. So if the Allies were to invade with 2 units, one in the 2 box and one invading from the 1 box, you would add +1 to the notional unit strength for the unit in the 2 box, and then you would add an additional 2 for invading from the 1 box for a total of +3. So in this example, if the Commonwealth were invading with these 2 militia units, the hex of Mogadishu, the notional combat strength would be 1 +1 for the city, +1 for being in the zone of control of a friendly unit, +1 for the 2 box, +2 for the 1 box, for a total of 3, 4, 5, 6. And the invading units, since they're not Marines, would be halved. So the Commonwealth would be looking at a 4-factor invasion against a 6-factor notional unit. So you can see how it can really add up if the enemy is invading from lower sea boxes. So the moral of that story is always try to invade from the 3 or 4 box if at all possible, because it will give you a shore bombardment modifier of 0. Now, there are a couple of ways the notional unit strength can be reduced. If the notional unit cannot trace a supply path of any length, you subtract 1 from the notional unit strength. How does that come into play? Well, let's say the Japanese were to invade the Commonwealth-controlled hex of Diego Garcia here in the West Indian Ocean. If the Japanese had surface combat ships or naval aircraft in any of the sections of the West Indian Ocean sea box and the Allies had none, then the supply, that would block the trace of supply through the sea zone, and therefore the notional unit on Diego Garcia would have no basic supply trace to a supply source, and thus you would subtract 1 from its combat factor. The other way it can be reduced is if it is surprised. And I don't think we've talked about surprise yet, but basically when a country is surprised when it is declared war on by a major power it's not currently at war with, even if it's at war with somebody else. So for example, if the Commonwealth is at war with Germany, and they have been since 1939, and Japan declares war on the Commonwealth, then the very first impulse that Japan is active following that declaration of war, it will be considered a surprise impulse for Japan, and there are numerous surprise effects, which we'll discuss in a future episode. But just in terms of notional units, you would subtract 1 from that notional unit strength. And that is something for the Japanese player especially to keep in mind when they decide to come into the war against the Allies. They will have a surprise impulse, which will allow them to carry off a lot of invasions against 0 strength notional units because of the surprise, and in some cases the inability to trace a basic supply path. Now, once you have calculated the modified combat factor of the notional unit, you simply add that to any defending units that are in the hex, and the notional unit is treated exactly like a normal unit, with the exception of it has a zone of control only in its own hex, not in adjacent hexes, and it is always face down. So this is where a little bit of confusion comes in sometimes, because at the end of the attack declaration step, the defender can state that the notional unit will be ignored. And why would you ever do that? Well, you don't want the +1 to the attack roll for the attacker because the notional unit is considered face down, and on the land CRT, the attacker gets a +1 for each face down land unit. Or perhaps you don't want a potential breakthrough by land units that are attacking in conjunction with the invading forces. So you would just ignore the notional unit in those cases. And if it's ignored, if you ignore the notional unit and there are no real units in the hex, then there's no attack, and the invading units simply occupy the hex as if they're debarking. So I hope that kind of covers notional units in a little more detail for everyone. You can find the rules. There's only about 3 or 4 paragraphs that cover notional units in section 11.15.1 on page 35. And it has a little chart both on page 35 showing the modifiers for the notional unit combat factors. And you can also find that chart reproduced on the Pacific chart in the upper left-hand corner, right up here with all of those, so that'll keep you from having to flip back and keep referencing the rule book every time you need to calculate some notional units. So again, I hope this clarifies notional units as well as a couple of mistakes regarding invasions from the last episode. Up next will be our episode on naval combat, and that will be a fairly long video because the naval combat is rather involved in World in Flames. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to click like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.